Hi, I'm Varun Haran. I'm Managing Director for Asia and Middle East with Information Security Media Group. I'm talking about API security. It's my pleasure to be speaking with Jacques Leclerc, who is the CEO of 42 Crunch. Hi, Jacques.
Hi, Aaron. Very pleased to be here.
My pleasure. Jacques, APIs are all the rage right now, and I believe we were talking earlier, and you quoted one Akamai report that said about 85% of internet traffic is now coming through APIs, right? So API security is obviously something that we need to take more seriously. So what's the state of API security right now? What does the landscape look like?
Well, that's a big question. Let me try to answer in a couple of parts. Yes, APIs are rising, mainly due to the ease of use to have those small interface talking to any application. So it's really a way to connect any data with any data. But the rise of IoT, of different applications, the perimeter getting kind of expanded or disappearing into lots, have been the rise of lots of communication going through APIs. And in terms of API security, well, it's been left behind, to be honest, in the last few years. And many breaches in the last year happened through an API interface. So what is the problem? The real problem is a lot of companies have made the mistake that considering an API was a web application, and it's not quite the same. An API is not a web application. A web application used to have a web application server with a controller inside that used to do quite a lot of things in the application stack. Now, in the world of API, the client goes directly to the API, to the consumer of the API. And therefore, there's a lot more checks that needs to be done. Furthermore, API are very transparent in the way they talk to other API, and therefore there's more, the attack surface is getting bigger because it's a lot less controlled by the provider of the API. There's also a crime on the consumer of the APIs. So it's a big problem today.
So, when you look at the landscape today in enterprises, I mean, there's so many different APIs at play, and even between enterprises, their vendors, third parties, supply chain. What do you see as the problems when it comes to securing that entire information infrastructure?
When you want to secure an API, you have to consider many things. People talk about the network, so the integrity of the network, of the transport. You have to consider the integrity of the data that's going through the API. You have to consider the things like SLAs. You have to consider things like data privacy, so usually handled by encryption. Non-repudiation. So there's quite a few categories that unfortunately you have to deal with if you want to do real, proper API security. The way it is done today by companies is through a multiple source of solutions. So people used to do a little bit of security, maybe with CDN products, high up the network. They might use an API or not an API, but maybe a traditional firewall to try to do some traditional techniques of filtering at this level. Some other company are a very popular solution in what we call API gateways and API management, who are solutions that are more here for integration and orchestration, but you can do a few policies, namely authentication authorization. And then company ask their developers to also try to put something directly in the code of the API to try to do some security. The problem is none of those products really talk to each other, there's no integration to each other, and it's still the traditional old way of doing security, which is usually after the fact. What we recommend, and most analysts around recommend, is a real shift in security in the world of API. We have the chance in the world of API to have a contract, so it's a definition of the interface. So if I expose an API for consumer to consume my API as a company, I describe in that contract how you call my API, what operation, what you're allowed to do, not allowed to do. So this contract is very valuable for security people because you can describe not just the transport, the operation, the path, but you can describe every operation, the parameters, all the security requirements. You can do it properly. And for example, at 42 Crunch, we provide tools to help developers describe very accurately their contract to be able to then enforce them at runtime anywhere in the network. So the key thing for me is to shift, what we call shift left, in terms of trying to get the developer who have written those API, they understand them, to help with the definition and the description of that API so that it becomes much, much easier for security to enforce this contract into the network.
Okay. So, we've talked about why API security is relevant and how it needs to be done. What you're telling me is essentially you're linking DevSecOps and API security together, right?
Exactly.
So how do we make a case for why this is important and why the traditional methods are not going to work in the current scenario?
Well, I'll give you a good example. I was talking, I won't mention them, but a very large financial institution this morning, where they have over 1,000 APIs in their company. And they use very agile development. They use DevOps, and now they're trying to use DevSecOps. And they try to have a very agile development, which means for them, some of their APIs change weekly. And within a week, the traditional way of trying to write security policies, then try to implement them at runtime in production, they need to be tested, they need to be QA'd, and then you put it on the production, is too late. So literally, they're always behind the security. So therefore, as you mentioned, the key to security really, especially in the world of microservices and very agile development, is really to integrate security directly into the DevOps. And that's what we call DevSecOps, to put it directly in that pipeline into the CI/CD, so that security, like, for example, Kubernetes these days is becoming infrastructure as code, we'd like security to become security as code into a DevSecOps process. So every time your developer push a new version of the API into, for example, GitHub or Git, then the pipeline starts, keeps the security requirements. You can assess the security, assess the policies. If there's a problem, redo them, and then this is redeployed automatically at the same time as the API. The life cycle of the API evolves. The life cycle of the security should be exactly matching the life cycle of the API.
That's fascinating, the entire idea that you talked about. So essentially, earlier you had mentioned something that stuck with me, is Kubernetes API firewall, essentially a firewall for each and every API. That's what your company does. How would it work in practice?
Well, in practice, it's quite simple. It's purely because of the demand of customers trying to deploy more and more application in the cloud, which usually means more and more microservices for obvious reason. You gain scalability and flexibility in the cloud. Kubernetes is becoming very, very popular. We see a huge rise of companies using Kubernetes to deploy their infrastructure in the cloud. And to be able to cope with down the security, we generate what we call micro API Kubernetes firewall, which are very small footprint, very low latency firewall. That gets their configuration from the CI/CD pipeline, so all the security policies gets attached to that firewall, but it's unique to each API. So we deploy those micro API firewall in the Kubernetes environment, a firewall for each API. It's a one-to-one in the same pod of the actual Kubernetes where the API runs. So it's literally, it makes more sense in the security because it's security at depth, right at the end. Just before the API is actually called, that's where the firewall resides. So it's a question of being able to scale as quickly as the developers scale their application.
Thank you, Jacques, for sharing that fascinating insight with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So that was Jacques Declas, who is CEO of 42 Crunch. For ISMG, this is Varun. Thank you for watching.